First, thank you so much for inviting me here today. I definitely am honored. I was taking a look at the rest of the colloquium series throughout the rest of the semester, and I was like, oh, I want to come to that. Oh, I want to come to that. So very, very honored to be a part of this series. So today, I want to talk about why don't more black students take AP math courses, and this notion of whether there's racialized tracking, social isolation, or what people refer to as the acting white hypothesis. What's at the root of this disparity in black student take-up of advanced placement courses? So, just a quick overview. So I am going to go through a little bit of background of the academic achievement gap and what's unique about this current study. My conceptual framework, I just want to put the caveat in there. As an economist, our theoretical frameworks are often unnecessarily convoluted or complex. So even though my slides are in econ speak because I am an economist, I will speak English in describing what I'm talking about when it's up there. So please bear with me when we go there. And then I will work through our empirical strategy in estimating the causes of these differences. And then we'll hopefully get into a nice discussion. Okay? So, the academic achievement gap. So when we talk about the academic achievement gap in education, we're typically referring to test scores, a black-white test score gap. And just to give you an idea, these are graphs from the National Assessment of Education Progress test, which are basically given to 4th graders and 8th graders. So 9-year-olds and 13-year-olds in nationally representative samples, and they've been doing it long term. This goes back to 1978, but it's here just to show you that there has been this persistent score gap between black students and white students. This is in mathematics for 9-year-olds, similar thing for the 13-year-olds in math, similar gap for 9-year-olds in reading, and a similar gap for 13-year-olds in reading, right? And so the reason I put these up here is because, one, I want to show that the gap is persistent and not necessarily closing. That's important because after the Civil Rights Movement and after Brown versus Board, and we thought, oh, we're integrating schools, this is going to solve these resource gaps that we have, and these solving the resource gap is going to help decrease these score gaps, right? Well, here we are in these go to 2004, but if I extended it out to today, we'd have this similar gap, right? So that wasn't necessarily the answer. And so I want to talk a little bit about, why we still have these achievement gaps. And here the achievement gaps are measured in test scores, but we can think of achievement gaps in our schools along many different lines. Graduation rates, we can think of advanced course take-up, right? Any positive measure we see in schools, a gap where blacks are falling behind, and any negative measure, such as behavior, discipline, things like that, it appears as though black students are overrepresented. Okay. So why does the achievement gap matter? Why do we care about these test scores? Well, in general, test scores have been shown to be positively correlated with educational attainment, how far you go in school. Educational attainment, therefore, is then positively correlated with wages and income, right? And then wages and income are positively correlated with a whole host of other life outcomes. Right, so we follow this correlation stream and we think that it matters. It matters that we see these differences at young ages and they may be manifesting themselves in differences later in life. Okay, so typically 2 schools of thought have dominated the research literature when it comes to explaining the achievement gap. Culturalists argue that black students are less likely to possess the personal traits that contribute to academic success, such as effort and perseverance, and they're more likely to surrender to negative peer pressure from peers who don't value education. So that's the culturalist argument, that there is an oppositional culture that arises among black students that's unique to black students, such that when they see other black students doing things like studying hard, right, or speaking properly, they accuse them of acting white, and therefore, in an effort to not be accused of acting white, we see sort of purposeful avoidance of academic behaviors. So that's one argument. Structuralists, on the other hand, tend to point to institutional barriers that differently disadvantage Black children, and those include the continuing racial segregation, racialized tracking within schools, bias in the implementation of disciplinary policies and procedures, and other within-school structural issues that negatively affect Blacks disproportionately. Okay? And so we have these two schools of thought, which then leads to great sort of academic debate, which is the researcher's joy, right? We get to go in and answer a question. So, so that's part of what I've been exploring in my research for the past few years. And just to take a little note, there have been many researchers who have gone on to explore these cultural explanations for the Black-white achievement gap and have found little support that an oppositional culture or this notion of acting white is really at the root cause of any of the achievement gap. So, for example, Cook and Lugwig find that actually, using a nationalized sample, they find that Black students actually study and spend just as much time as white students on their schoolwork outside of school. They value their long-term educational outcomes just as much. There's no evidence that Black students are disproportionately anti-school. Similarly, Ferguson in 2001, and Angel Harris in 2006 uses a sample of students in Baltimore, Maryland to sort of step-by-step dismantle some of the results of the oppositional culture hypothesis. In economics, the most rigorous theoretical treatment of the achievement gap comes from an Austin Smith and Fryer paper in 2005. And so what they do, they use a two-audience signaling model where they say your choice of educational investment, right, is a signal to both future employers but also to your peers. And you care about what your peers think, and you also care about what future employers think. And their conclusion is that it may be possible that some students underinvest in education because they care about what their peers think in a way that induces them to try to sort of act cooler, right? And what's important to note about the paper is that nothing in their model says that this behavior would be unique to Black students. And I'll be fair to them and even say that they point out in their conclusion that acting white is not unique to Blacks, and we purposefully reference other groups plagued by similar phenomena, right? So they also state that the behavior is the result of a strategic interaction for which any group with the same initial conditions would fall victim. As such, nothing should be ascribed to the inherent values, preferences, or ideologies of particular groups who are plagued by this insidious form of social interaction. Right, so they're very clear in their conclusions to say there's nothing unique about Blacks to suggest that they are the ones to fall victim to what they call in their title the acting white hypothesis, but they are really calling it underinvestment in education, right? But unfortunately, despite these brief caveats at the end of the paper, they devote a large portion of their manuscript describing anecdotes and anthropological literature that ascribe acting white phenomenon to Blacks, right? So even though they put this at the end, like we're primed to think, oh, this is why Black students underinvest. This is a perfect theoretical example. So therefore, it's not surprising that many researchers have cited the Austin Smith and Fryer model and subsequent empirical work by Fryer and his co-authors as indisputable evidence of Black students' cultural predisposition towards underachievement. So what I want to do instead is examine this model by Tyson, Darity, and Castellino, and more specifically Tyson in her book. Let me just click through there. Okay, so what they do is they have interview and observational data from secondary schools in North Carolina. And they find, after interviewing students, parents, teachers, and observing students, they find that high-achieving blacks were actually not deterred from taking AP courses, right, for fear of being accused of acting white. They were more afraid of failure, right? So they go in and they say, let's test this acting white hypothesis in the specific case of black students taking AP calculus courses or AP courses, right? And they're talking to the students and they say, it's not that we're afraid of being accused of acting white, it's that I don't think I'm gonna do good in this course, right? So that's a preparation thing, and that speaks to differences in the feeder schools leading into these high schools, more than to sort of a cultural problem with black students. They found that white students also experienced hostility from their lower achieving peers, right? So the problem with some of the acting white work and the oppositional culture hypothesis was that there's no comparison group. So I could go in, as Fordham and Ogbu did in their oppositional culture study, and find that some black students did say, yes, people told me I was acting white because I spoke properly. But then they could also go and talk to white students and find that, yes, people called me a nerd, right, because I study too hard, right? So it's not, it's a different word for the same thing. And so again, here, that's coming out that white students also experience similar hostility from lower achieving peers, right? You're a nerd, you're a geek, so on and so forth. And finally, they find that AP courses are actually very socially isolating for blacks. There are not a lot of black students historically in these classes, and so even when black students are taking these classes, they find it hard to integrate themselves into white peer groups, even when they've tried, right? So that was some of the comments that they heard. Like, these are the folks that I'm in class with all day, so I try to, you know, integrate into their lunch group and this, that, or whatever, but they find it very difficult to do so. And then they also find it very hard then to socially relate with other black students in the school who are not in there every single class, okay? So finally, they conclude that it's school structure rather than culture that explains why some students devalue taking these honors courses. Lower income white students as well as black students may avoid honors course taking when there's historic within school tracking that produces this visible class and race divide between those students who are in the honors classes and those students who aren't. So what we wanted to do in this paper, this is joint work between myself, Sandy Darity, and Carabano at Duke, we wanted to say, well, let's look at that theoretically and empirically from the economist's viewpoint. And so the contributions from this study, so one, we're looking at course selection rather than test scores when we're examining the achievement gap. So that's somewhat of a novel contribution. And the other, we're doing a quantitative exploration of the impacts of racialized tracking. And then most importantly, which I probably should have put up there, is giving a different theoretical model than the Austin Smith and Fryer model to think about this question, right? So to move away from this acting white theoretical concept and say, there's another way to look at that, okay? So what I'm gonna do now is go through that conceptual framework. So again, this is the econ speak, so I'm gonna speak it out in English. So we assume that, let's assume we have a student, and this student arrives at 11th grade and is making the choice of whether or not to take an AP class, right? So that's what we say, their choice set is to take AP or not to take AP, right? And so we're gonna say that among students, a student could either be, either have a quote unquote low endowment or a high endowment. When I say endowment, that's all the things that are gonna help them lower the cost to them of taking an AP course, right? So if a student has high endowment, maybe they're just, you know, sort of naturally smart, right? They've that, or they also have a high endowment because their parents have the resources to get them tutoring, right? So these things that, that make it easier for someone to succeed in an AP course contribute to them having a high endowment, right? So there are low endowment types and high endowment types. And I'm not gonna say anything about race right now, right? We're just talking about in general. So the students get a payoff for their educational investment. So all this is saying is students who take AP courses tend to then also have higher graduation rates. They get, possibly if they pass the AP test, they get credit in college, right? There are payoffs that can help them finish college faster, so on and so forth. There are payoffs to investing in this choice, and that the payoff for taking AP courses is higher than the payoff of not taking AP courses. That's an assumption I'm making, right? And it's borne out in the literature. But there are also costs, right? So the costs are such that we don't have to think about normalizing to 0, 1, all of this. Okay, so the assumption I make about cost is that AP courses take more time, more investment time than non-AP courses. So if we think of it, the cost in terms of your time, taking an AP course takes more time than not taking an AP course. But we also assume that highly resourced, highly endowed students can spend less time on their coursework than less resourced students, right? The lesser endowed students, right? So if we think of all of our costs in this world, of this example as being time, right? It costs less to not take an AP course, but it also costs less for a highly resourced student to take an AP course than a lower resourced student. Okay? Okay. So, and then finally the last, one of the last assumptions on this slide that I'm going to make is that the net benefit of taking an AP course, right, is higher than the net benefit of not taking an AP course for high resource types. Right, so all this assumption is saying is that if you're highly resourced, rationally you should probably take an AP course because you're going to benefit from it in the long run and the cost is not too high for you, right? So we would assume that if everything is going right in the world, everybody who's highly resourced should probably be taking this AP course. That's what that assumption is telling me. Okay, so now we enter the peers, right? So in this world there's also a peer group, right? And so I assume that as a person, the thing that brings me happiness, which is this utility function, that's what that stands for, is getting the value from taking an AP course. The thing that takes away from my happiness is having to spend time on that AP course. But the other thing that brings me happiness is being accepted by a peer group, right? And so this is, you know, not a stretch for someone in high school, right? And so the probability, so how I set this up is that the probability that you're accepted by your peer group is a function of how much total time you spend with them, right? So you spend time with your peers, they like you, you're more likely to be accepted by them, right? And your total time is made up of time you spend in class and time you spend at leisure, right? Okay, so I'm not gonna, so then, what I've done here is set up this lambda, right? And this is an indicator variable that turns on. It's equal to 1 if there's a sufficient share of your own peer group that are taking AP courses, and it's equal to 0 otherwise, right? And the significance of this lambda is that for some group of people, they're going to get credit with their peer group for spending class time with them and for spending leisure time with them. But if you don't have enough of your peer group in your classes, you're not getting credit for that class time, right? And so in the end, we can think of, let's think of a specific student. Consider a student who's highly endowed, has a lot of resources. So we can compare her utility functions, her happiness, for choosing an AP course and not choosing an AP course. And the moral of the story here is that there's actually a case where a highly resourced student could possibly choose not to take an AP course. If lambda equals 1, which means there's a high enough share of your peer group in these classes with you, you always take an AP course, right? Because not only are you have a net benefit from taking it because you're a highly resourced type, but you also benefit because all of your peers are in that class too, and you're getting credit for class time and leisure time involvement with them, right? So you're going to have peer group acceptance, right? But if you're a highly resourced type and your peers are not in AP course, there is a case such that it's rational for you, you get a higher payoff for not taking AP, depending on these other net payoffs. So all this is telling you is that it could be perfectly rational for a student not to take AP courses if they value peer group acceptance and not enough of their peers are in that class, right? So for some students, taking AP and getting acceptance from your peers is a compliment, and for some, it's a trade-off, right? And so that's the important difference that my model makes, our model makes, that the Austin Smith and Fryer paper doesn't. So there's nothing underlying in any sort of, you know, cultural disposition of any of these students. It's a resource story, right? Do I have resources such that taking AP is not a challenge, a huge obstacle for me to overcome? And then it's also a peer story and a makeup of the school, right? Are there enough of my peers in this class such that I don't feel socially isolated? Okay? Okay. So, our empirical strategy. So what we want to do to kind of test this out a little bit with data from North Carolina is ask this question: what's the probability that a student takes an advanced placement course, math course, before they graduate, right? And we're going to estimate that probability as a function of the share of their particular peer group that are in AP classes when they land on campus, right? So what I'm going to say is I'm a 9th grader. I land on campus. I kind of notice these advanced courses and regular courses, and I see, oh, there's not a lot of, let's say, black students in AP courses, right? And so they're going to observe that, and then when it comes their time to choose whether or not to take AP courses, they're making that choice. So what we're saying is, what is the effect of the historical percentage of students in AP on your own personal decision to take AP courses, right? And we're also going to estimate it with controls, school level controls, individual level controls, and fixed effects. I'll talk a little bit more about that, but that just helps us isolate this share and convince us that it really is a cause and effect relationship. Okay. And then we estimate separate equations for schools that are predominantly white, racially diverse, and predominantly black. And we do that because of some of the insights of Carolyn Tyson's study, Integration Interrupted. Sorry, I didn't say the name of her book, Integration Interrupted, where she notices that if there is this phenomenon of being called acting white, but it only gets activated in these racially diverse schools where it's much easier to see this racial divide between classes, right? Predominantly white schools, you may see there's only 1 or 2 black students in the AP classes, but there's only 4 or 5 black students in the school, right? So it's not as salient. But it becomes salient when the schools are racially diverse and there's a stark racial divide in who's taking advanced courses and who's not, okay? And so we're going to split the sample up like that. Okay, so our estimation sample is based on 3 cohorts of North Carolina public high school students, and it's the universe of the public high school students in those years. They began school, the 3 cohorts began high school in the 04, 05, 05, 06, and 06, 07 school years, and we're on schedule to graduate in 2008, 2009, and 2010. That gives us over 240,000 students and over 500 high schools from 100 school districts, right? So we have a lot of data points to be able to conduct our analysis. And so the final thing we do is we actually restrict our analysis to black students who are eligible to take math courses, advanced math courses by their 11th or 12th grades, right? So we want to know, of the students who are eligible, do they take it? Right, there's a whole nother story about why students aren't eligible at that time, and I do work on that as well, but you know, that's a different story. These students who are eligible to take it, why don't they? Okay, so to give you a little bit of information about who is in the overall sample of schools, in North Carolina, the sample is about 1% American Indian, 2% Asian, 29% black, 61% white, and then also there's a 5% Hispanic and 2% identify as multiracial. So by and large, there's a sort of black-white dichotomy in the population of public school students, evenly split between male and female, and then about 43% of students' parents have either high school education or less. Okay, just to give you an idea. And then this just breaks it out. The three different cohorts, they're pretty similar. There's not much different across the cohorts there. We don't see huge trends except possibly a slightly rising percentage of Hispanic students. Okay. So the school characteristics. Basically, we see schools going from a wide diversity of schools. So there are some schools with 0% American Indian and the maximum 27% American Indian. Almost 0% black to 100% black, 0% white to 98% white. And similarly across the different cohorts. So the racial composition of schools, you have schools that are almost homogeneously black, you have schools that are almost homogeneously white, and all the in-between. And then finally, this is just to show you the breakout of our school diversity measure. And so what this is showing you are these are all individual schools. And this is the percentage of students in a school who are white and the percentage of students in a school who are black. And so we actually eliminated those schools for whom the black plus white student share is less than 50%. Right, because we're telling a story about black students, and if there are not either black or white students in the school, it just wasn't for this particular study. And then the other thing we do is that this is the line that demarcates whether or not a school is considered predominantly white, racially diverse, and then predominantly black. And our results are robust to moving these lines a bit, right? It's not. We don't just have it right here, and then if we don't have this particular breakout, that the results don't hold up. They hold up if I say, okay, we'll call a predominantly black school 60% or more. They still hold up. Okay. All right. So just to give you an idea of advanced course participation by race. The blue lines are for if a student in a particular racial group, the percentage of students in a particular racial group who are ever eligible during their high school career to take the AP course, AP math courses. And then the red is those who actually do take them, right? So we see some of the biggest drop in ever eligible to actually taking them is among black students, right? But that there are big drops across the board, but the biggest drop is among black students. And they're also the least likely to take these AP math courses. And just to be clear, advanced courses include both AP Calc, AP Statistics, International Baccalaureate high math levels, discrete math, and probability and statistics. And the reason I include discrete math and probability and statistics is that we found in the data that most students actually took those two courses after they'd taken AP Calc. So they were much higher level courses in general in North Carolina at the time. Okay. All right, and so the last sample statistic I'll show, by design, the predominantly white schools go from 0 to 25% black, the racially diverse schools go 25 to 50% black, and the predominantly black schools go from 50 to 100. But what I want to show here is that predominantly in all schools, there's a disparity between the percentage of students in a school who are black and the percentage of students in AP courses that are black. Right, so there's always a disparity. Even in the predominantly black schools, we see that. And a lot of times that's because these are magnet schools where there's a specific program that's meant to draw in students back into the city where predominantly black populations are, and so those students who are typically white students will be the ones who are in these special programs, and the special programs are usually the enriched programs, right? So that's why we even see this disconnect in predominantly black schools. Okay? The other thing is that predominantly black schools are also offer the least number of advanced math courses. Right? We don't see a huge difference between predominantly white and racially diverse schools, but that's also something to take into account. Okay, so what do I find? So I'm going to orient you to this chart. So So these are marginal effects of the share of black students in AP courses on the propensity of eligible black students to have ever taken an AP course. And the different models, this model has they all have student controls, but this model does not have school controls, so controlling for differences between schools. This model does have school controls, but this model is the preferred model because I use school fixed effects. And what school fixed effects do is it tells us, let's estimate this model within the same school, right, based off the different 3 cohorts I have, right? So some people might say, well, yeah, the share of students may have an effect on whether or not the student takes AP or not, but there's so many other different things about the schools that you're comparing between that it may be that's causing it and not necessarily this AP share that you're claiming. So in order to get away from that, I say, okay, we'll look within the same school, right? So these are within the same school, one cohort of 9th graders lands and they see 1 share, and then the next year a different cohort lands and there's a different share. So within the same sort of school environment, what effect does the share of black students in AP have on that student's propensity to take it? Okay, and so, so to give you an example, what this is telling me is that within these racially diverse schools, a 1% increase in the share of black students taking AP courses would lead to a 20% more, would lead a 9th grader to be 20% more likely to take AP classes by the time he or she got to their 11th or 12th grade year, right? So just 1% more students in these AP classes, I'm 20% more likely to take the class, right? In predominantly black schools, that's a 13% increase in the likelihood. And then what we have in predominantly white schools, we see this change in sign and an increase in the magnitude. So one thing again there that I take with that, because this makes it seem like an increase in black students in AP courses makes me less likely as a black student to take AP classes in predominantly white schools. And so we are still teasing out mechanisms there, but quite frankly, what we've landed on is this notion that, again, in predominantly white schools, the racial factor is just less salient, and so they may be choosing their peer groups along other dimensions. And so it just may not be as accurate an indicator in these schools. But the other thing is it might be a constraint scenario where there's just fewer spaces, and so we're doing things where we can kind of try to test this constraint story, or we can try to test this is it other things that are more salient when choosing your peer groups in these predominantly white schools. We're working on that. But one of the things that we decided to do was say, well, let's separate it by gender, right? Because often our peer groups are also gendered, and we're interested in these intersectionalities of gender and race. So what we did was say, okay, then what's the marginal effect of the share of black female students in AP courses on the propensity of eligible black female students to have ever taken an AP course? And here, 24% more likely if you see a black female student in AP courses when you're a 9th grader. You're in racially diverse schools, you're about 13% more likely in these predominantly black schools. And here the sign, again, turns positive. So we're still working this out, but that may indicate this question of, is it something other than race, right? When we start to look at gender, it begins to matter whether or not there are other females in math classes, in these AP math classes. And then most interestingly, when we run the sample with only black male students, the numbers are huge, right? So by just seeing a 1% greater share of black male students in these AP courses, I'm 40% more likely myself as a black male student to take this AP course, right? And 36% in the predominantly black schools. And again, we don't see any significance in the predominantly white schools. Right, so this, this is a key result for us, that that the effects are strongest among black male students, but that they are still strong when we separate them out, and that there are definitely gendered effects going on here. Okay. So our strongest associations between within-school segregation and black student propensity to take AP courses shows up in these racially diverse schools. They show up among black male students. And so what policy implications are there? So when I started off the talk, I talked about the differences from the culturalist perspective and structuralist perspective, and those differences are not trivial from a policy perspective. Right? If I think that the reason for the achievement gap or the reason that black students aren't taking AP courses is because of something culturally inherent in black students, then all of my policy solutions are aimed at improving what's wrong with black students, right? So then we have a lot of our, mentoring programs, My Brother's Keeper, things like that, which are great programs, but may not answer that particular question if I believe, as a structuralist do, that there are other things going on. Right? So I can mentor students as much as I want to mentor them, but here we see that there are students who are academically eligible, right, who are not afraid of being called acting white, who are still not taking these courses because they don't think they can succeed in them. And that may have something to do with landing on campus and seeing, well, who is taking these courses? And if I see another black student or a large share of black students succeeding in taking these courses, I'm more likely myself to take the courses. Right, so from a policy perspective, it's this notion of, great, continue to have mentoring programs and things that, that help inspire students, and particularly black students. But if you really want to answer some of these policy gaps, these academic achievement gaps, you're going to have to look at what's going on within the schools. Historically, what's going on in the schools currently, is there some implicit bias in who's even being recommended to take these courses, right? So there are other things that you're going to have to start looking at other than fixing black students and as to why there's these gaps. And that's it. That's so I can open it up to questions. Thank you.